Welcome to our Encounter Bible Study for the week of June 12. We are continuing in the book of Job, an 8-week look at the book of Job. This is the second week, and let's just jump right into a really quick review. As you already know, many people know the story of Job. He's a man who had it all and lost it all. He loses his 10 children, 7 sons and 3 daughters, all of his flocks, everything that he owned, and then he is eventually stricken with boils, and so he loses his health as well. And all of that is a test to see if he is faithful, to see if he will curse God and die. And late in the second chapter of Job, 3 of his friends who have heard that he's going through a difficult time, they show up. And they see Job, and he is so much more horrible than they ever could have imagined, and in so much worse shape that they rend their clothes and they sit in this ash heap with him, and they put ash on their foreheads, and they don't say a word for 7 days. And right there is a wonderful inspiration. We don't always have to have the words to say when we encounter someone who is suffering, whether they are a loved one or just someone who is suffering in some other way. But we do need to find ways to be compassionate with them, to sit with them in their suffering, to be with them in their suffering. And Job's friends do that. And then the third chapter opens with Job beginning to explain how he is feeling and what is going on with him. And we're going to use the third chapter as kind of a synopsis of all of Job's arguments and pleadings and questions. It's not complete, of course, but we're going to use it just kind of as a synopsis, and we'll study it today. And as I read the third chapter, I'm going to read it from the book, The Message, or the Bible translation, the paraphrase, The Message, that Eugene Peterson did. And I want to do that because Peterson does a great job of taking the very complex Greek and making it understandable to us in English. And as I read this, I want you to assume that something is just going to kind of grab your attention. Maybe almost like it'll stand out in bold for you, or maybe sometimes people say it will shimmer for you. But one phrase or one verse or maybe even one word is just going to grab you. And I want you to assume that is going to happen, and that may be what it is that God needs for you to hear or to learn about for today. But let me share with you now the third chapter of the book of Job. Then Job broke the silence. He spoke up and cursed his fate. Obliterate the day I was born. Blank out the night I was conceived. Let it be a black hole in space. May God above forget it ever happened. Erase it from the books. May the day of my birth be buried in deep darkness, shrouded by the fog, swallowed by the night. And the night of my conception, the devil take it. Rip the date off the calendar. Delete it from the almanac. Oh, turn that night into pure nothingness. No sounds of pleasure from that night ever. May those who are good at cursing curse that day. Unleash the sea beast, Leviathan, upon it. May its morning stars turn to black cinders, waiting for a daylight that never comes, never once seeing the first light of dawn. And why? Because it released me from my mother's womb into a life with so much trouble. Why? Why didn't I die at birth? My first breath out of the womb, my last? Why were there arms to rock me and breasts for me to drink from? I could be resting in peace right now, asleep forever, feeling no pain, in the company of kings and statesmen in their royal ruins, or with princes resplendent in their gold and silver tombs. Why wasn't I still born and buried with all the babies who never saw light, where the wicked no longer trouble anyone and bone-weary people get a long-deserved rest? Prisoners sleep undisturbed, never again to wake to the bark of the guards. The small and the great are equals in that place, and slaves are free from their masters. Why does God bother giving light to the miserable? Why bother keeping bitter people alive? Those who want in the worst way to die and can't. Who can't imagine anything better than death. Who count the day of their death and burial the happiest day of their life. What's the point of life when it doesn't make sense? when God blocks all the roads to meaning. Instead of bread, I get groans for supper, and then leave the table and vomit my anguish. The worst of my fears has come true. What I've dreaded most has happened. My repose is shattered, my peace destroyed. No rest for me ever. Death has invaded life. Peterson does a good job of pointing out, I think, the poetry in there. And there's so many powerful phrases that we hear in there. And I wonder which ones leapt out for you. And let's just take a moment or two and just think about that phrase or those phrases that leapt out for you. So many things leapt out at me the first time I read it through when I was preparing for this study. What leapt out for me was not only did he bemoan the day he was born, but even the day he was conceived. And there's even a little bit of salty language in there. But he says, turn that night into pure nothingness. No sounds of pleasure from that night ever. So I don't even want to have been conceived, much less ever having been born. Job also states later in there that I wish I were dead. And no doubt you have felt that way at some time in your life. That is a very, very common human emotion. That I don't know if I wish I wasn't conceived, perhaps, but I certainly have felt like I wish I hadn't been born, and I guess that's the same thing. Or I wish that I was dead now, that I just don't want to deal with this anymore. I just want to run away, and the ultimate running away, of course, is death. As a pastor, one of my jobs is to be with people when they're going through some of the worst times in their lives. And sometimes, of course, those times are self-inflicted, and sometimes they just hit right out of the blue for no seeming reason at all, and sometimes maybe it's a little mixture of both, but it really doesn't matter. Because when we find ourselves in the difficult times in life, and all of us find ourselves from time to time in those difficult times, we do ask questions. Why? Why did this happen? Why did God allow it? And all those kind of things. And they often can lead us into feeling like, I wish I wasn't alive anymore. And so I want to do a little public service announcement first early here and let you know, and I often do this with people who are suffering so much. I want you to know that thoughts of suicide or wishes that I wasn't alive anymore is very common. It's normal, even healthy in one sense. Where thoughts of suicide get dangerous are when you're making plans or even fantasizing about making plans. Here's how I would do it, and I know where I keep the gun or the pills or whatever it is that you might be thinking about, ways that you might kill yourself. Because what's going on there is you're starting to descend down into a pit, and you're spiraling down, and it is possible to get so far down into that pit that you can find no other way out than suicide. And yet suicide is such a horrible thing for an individual to go through, and there even are a number of accounts of people who have thrown themselves off of bridges or otherwise tried to kill themselves and realized in those last few moments, and later survived, I should mention, but they realized in those last few moments, this isn't what I want, and it's almost too late, and they really think it is too late, and they end up surviving and are able to tell those stories. Suicide isn't a good thing. It isn't something that we want to have to happen to us, and yet it does happen to a number of people. And so we want to make sure that doesn't happen to us. Job wishes he was dead, but never once does he attempt to take his own life, perhaps partly because his friends showed up to help him and to be there with him. That may be what saved his life. And if you sense yourself descending into that pit and you're afraid you can't get out, I want to encourage you. Call me. Call a pastor or a friend. There's a suicide hotline. That would be a wonderful thing to do, and you can just simply Google suicide hotline or suicide helpline, and the number will pop up for you. Reach out for help, recognizing that you are about to get beyond where you can help yourself, and you need someone else. And so I'm very thankful that Job's friends showed up, because they perhaps fulfilled that for him. And so Job is then able to pour his heart out to his friends, and I wonder if they didn't save his life. Now, as long as we're on the topic of suicide, and then we'll move on, oftentimes people say that suicide is the unpardonable sin, and if you commit suicide, you're going to end up in hell. The Bible only actually has two different accounts of people committing suicide in the whole Bible. The first is King Saul, where he literally falls on his own sword, and that's where we get that phrase, fall on your sword. He commits suicide when things are hopeless for him in a battle. And then Judas Iscariot, of course, after betraying Jesus and realizing what that led to, he commits suicide. But neither time does the Bible make a moral comment on their suicide. The Bible makes moral comments on what went before and their actions before, but not their actual suicide. And never does the Bible say that suicide is the unpardonable sin. I see suicide as a horrible, horrible tragedy. People who have fallen into a pit and cannot get out, and they need our pity more than they need our judgment. And I trust that they also get God's pity and God's mercy more than they get God's judgment. But let's go back to Job's story now, end of the public service announcement perhaps. And again, as I mentioned, we're using the 3rd chapter as kind of a synopsis of all of Job's arguments. But we should note that 18 of the 42 chapters in Job are Job's words, and they're all in poetry, beautiful poetry, although sometimes hard to understand poetry. And so close to half of the book is Job's words, and we're only looking at these few verses in this one chapter. And so we're going to miss some of the progression of his thought, and we're going to miss some of the other questions and arguments and pleadings that he has. And so I would recommend that you read the entire book of Job. It's only 42 chapters. It's not that long. And I would suggest reading it in a translation like the Message, or maybe another paraphrase that might be a little easier to understand. Even the new RSV, which I love so much, is a little bit obscure. So the passage I mentioned to you a minute ago where Peterson makes it clear, I just wish I wasn't even conceived, and I wish no sounds of pleasure had come out that evening. That salty language that's in there, Peterson captures in a way that even the NRSV doesn't quite capture. But the root of all of Job's questions really is why? Why was I born if I just have to suffer? Why is it that anybody has to suffer in this life? In the words of Rabbi Kushner, who wrote a book by this title, Why do bad things happen to good people? That is the central question in many ways for Job. And Job also asks, why does God allow suffering? Why does God permit suffering to happen? Very interestingly, nowhere in Job's words does he ever blame Satan, which is interesting because so often we do. If we're suffering, well, Satan is really after me, or we may say that about someone else. But Job never does. And partly it's because, presumably, Job doesn't know about what has happened in the heavenly cabinet room that we talked about last week, where Satan accuses Job of only being faithful because he's been blessed, and God allowing Satan to inflict the wounds and all of the trouble upon him. But I also think there's a sense in which Job recognizes it really doesn't matter what the cause is. If Satan or whoever caused it, Job is aware that God is powerful enough to have stopped it. And so for some reason, God permitted it. So we sometimes call that the permissive will of God, and it does lead to serious questions why. And Job asks those questions why. It doesn't seem fair, it doesn't seem good, and for Job, God also doesn't seem present. And Job answers or asks these questions again and again. Why? Now, Job and we, by the end of the book, are going to discover that God's not going to offer really great answers to these questions. Not that God is incapable, but God is basically going to say, you're not going to be able to understand the answers. That you are mortal and I'm immortal, and you're not going to be able to fully understand them. But I think it's so important to note that we are allowed to ask the question, and that although it happens in God's own time, God eventually does become present to Job, even as I mentioned, in a way that Job doesn't really predict or wouldn't have expected. It's also, I think, important to know that Job is not the only questioner in the Bible. Going back the same time period of Job, Abraham asked God, why in the world would you destroy Sodom and Gomorrah if there were 10 good people in there? And Abraham has this kind of debate back and forth with God, and that's a way of asking why. Jeremiah, at one point in Jeremiah, says, cursed be the day on which I was born, which is exactly the same quote, same thing that Job says. Jeremiah, who wrote Lamentations, writing for the people, is able to offer some faith. The hymn and the verse, morning by morning, new mercies I see, is in Lamentations. And yet the book of Lamentations is all about why. Why, God, even in the face of our sin, would you punish us so much and so completely and so horribly? And the book of Lamentations, in spite of the few little verses in there that offer some hope, ends with, why have you forgotten us so completely? Why have you forsaken us these many days? Restore us to yourself, O Lord, that we may be restored, unless you have utterly rejected us and are angry with us beyond measure. We don't understand, God, and we want to be restored, and you are not present, and we are still suffering, and we are still asking why. Jesus himself quoted, and mentioned this last week as well, Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? Has God truly forsaken us? No, probably not. But does it feel like God has forsaken us? Absolutely. Are we given permission to ask those questions? Absolutely. Because we are able, because they're the biblical characters, we're able to ask those questions as well, and we have their record. And if we were not allowed to ask those questions, the questions would not be contained in the Bible. And I think this is one of the wonderful truths of Christianity, and one of the wonderful things about Christianity is God desires so much to be in a relationship with us that God will allow us to question and argue and even accuse, and whether our accusations end up being founded or not, that isn't the point. God allows us to do those things without striking us down. Other gods that we see in elsewhere might find that to be blasphemy and would strike down their subjects who would dare to question them. But God allows us that, and it's a gift, even though it's a gift that comes in the midst of suffering. And I have to keep going back and forth because I don't want to minimize the suffering of Job or the suffering of anyone else. But I do want us to draw a few concepts, uneasy perhaps concepts, from this passage and from the book of Job, from Job's questions and arguments and pleadings, and recognize that first, that suffering is very real. Suffering is not an illusion. Suffering is not just in our heads. Suffering is a very real experience that all of us have, and it will lead us to ask questions and to wonder, where is God? May even wonder, is there a God? And Job calls on us to hold God to account, in a sense, to hold God's feet to the fire. I know my Redeemer will live, as we said last week, and one day will stand upon the ground. God, I just want the chance to accuse you, but also to have you help me understand what is going on. And so the first thing I want to note is it is okay and even faithful to question God. And sometimes we hear people say, well, you can't question God. Well, not according to Job, and not according to the Bible. Questioning God is very human, and it's even faithful. A different kind of faith, perhaps. Not a faith that just says, well, I'll accept whatever, or try to ignore whatever. I think that really is the idea that maybe suffering is just in our heads. No, we don't ignore the suffering. We experience suffering, and we ask God, why are we suffering? And we ask God to do something about the suffering. Second, I think we need to note, and this is very important, that there may be times that you feel you can't experience God's presence or God's love or God's comfort. And I also think we need to know that is so common for everyone. Now, sometimes people think that we pastors have a direct line to God, that everybody actually has that direct line, and that we are just always walking around just basking in God's presence. Well, that's not true, because we're human and we suffer as well, just as Job did, just as Jeremiah did, just as Jesus did, and we have to ask these questions. And sometimes we don't feel close to God, and sometimes we say of people, well, if you don't feel close to God anymore, guess who moved? And sometimes that is true. There have been times in my life that I have ignored spiritual disciplines. I haven't taken the time to pray, to try to put myself into God's presence, and I don't experience God's presence. And sometimes even then, when I have moved, God moves to bring me back even before I do. I'm that lost sheep out there in the wilderness. I haven't realized I'm lost, and God comes and retrieves me. But there are other times when I haven't really moved, and there are maybe other times, I'm sure, when you haven't moved. The book of Job begins by showing just how faithful he was. He hasn't moved away from God, and yet these awful experiences that he has makes him wonder, where are you, God? And rather than blame him and say, if you don't feel close to God anymore, guess who moved? I think we need to bless his question. It's okay to ask those questions, and you keep asking those questions. Now, Unfortunately, longing for God's presence doesn't guarantee that God will come and be present with us. And in what is a great mystery, it may be a long, long time. In Job, it's 38 chapters or so, and we don't know how long that is in time. For other people, even very faithful people, it can be years in which they do not experience God's presence, and they just have to kind of hang on, and it's not easy. You may have heard the phrase, the long dark night of the soul, and it was coined by a man called St. John of the Cross, and he went for years without being able to experience God's presence, and he kept pleading for God's presence, and that he is to be commended for that, begging God to be present to him, and he went for years and years, though, without experiencing it, and he called it the long dark night of the soul, and some of you may know that same long dark night. Mother Teresa, in our own time and age, we learned after her death, she went through great times where she could not experience God's presence. As a matter of fact, in some of her personal notes, she says that from 1948 until her death in 1997, that she would go great periods of time without experiencing God's presence, except for very brief interludes. And yet she found a way not only to keep asking for God's presence, but continuing to serve this God who seemed to be not present to her. I wish she had let us know that during her lifetime. She hid it from us then. I think she was afraid it might hurt the faith of those that she was trying to care for. But I think it maybe would have served as even a better inspiration for us to know that she was still going out into the streets of Calcutta and doing all she could for the least of these, my brothers and sisters in Christ, when she could not experience the presence of Christ with her. And I think there's a lot, though, that can inspire us about St. John and Mother St. Teresa, well, I guess she is St. Teresa now, Mother Teresa, and also Job and Jeremiah and Jesus, that it's okay to ask those questions, to hang on and wait for God to act in God's own time. And so, as a way to kind of conclude today's story or today's lesson, I want to tell you a story about another St. Teresa, and this is St. Teresa of Avila. She lived back in the 1500s, and in 1582, which actually happened to also be the year of her death, she was on a mission to set up some new convents around in France where she was living. And she and some other sisters were making her way from town to town, trying to set up these convents in places where she felt led to set them up. And they came to a place where the river was really swollen, and it had overflown the banks and was rushing across the bridge, and they were in a carriage, and they were afraid that if they took the carriage across the bridge, and the carriage just got slightly off center, and it was hard to see, of course, where the bridge was because of the water coming across, that they could be swept away. And so Teresa decided that maybe perhaps they should try to walk across. I'm not quite sure what they planned to do with the carriage after that, but she decided they should walk across, and the other sisters weren't so sure. And she was their mother superior, and so they would have called her Mother Teresa. Mother Teresa, if we do that, we may be swept away to our death. And she assured them that even if they were swept away, this was a noble cause. They were doing God's work, and so they would die noble deaths. And so she kind of plunges into the water in this moment of, I suppose you might call it faith, you might call it foolishness, but sure enough, when she got out just a little bit, she was almost swept away, and she was clinging to the side of the bridge there or whatever, and someone was able to pull her back out to safety, but she very nearly lost her life, and she called out, "Oh my Lord, when will you stop scattering obstacles in our path?" Now, St. Teresa often had visions of Christ, and she sensed Christ speaking to her at that moment. And Christ said to her, "Do not complain, daughter, for this is how I always treat my friends." And Teresa immediately answered him, "Ah, Lord, that explains then why you have so few." And I love that story because she clearly doesn't mind kind of sassing Jesus back. She doesn't mind talking back to Jesus. Here I've just tried to do a noble thing. All I needed was your help getting across this bridge. And what happens? I'm nearly swept to my death. And so I come out and I ask you a simple question. Why is it that you're throwing these obstacles in our path? You told me you wanted me to go to this other city and begin this convent, and now you're nearly killing me in the process. And Jesus says to her, "Oh, daughter, this is how I treat my friends." And she's not having any of it. Well, then that's why you have so few. I love that attitude. And it's a little bit playful, but there's also this sense in which she knows that she loves Jesus so much, and Jesus loves her so much that she can come at him even with a little bit of bitterness. It may not be playfulness at all, and say, well, this is why you have so few, and it's hard for me to help you make more friends if this is the way that you treat your friends. Job, I think, does that as well. And so let us desire and pray for and commit ourselves to being like Job and these other witnesses that we've mentioned this day, knowing that for inexplicable reasons, God allows terrible things to happen. And we can't understand that. That doesn't mean we have to like them. That doesn't mean that we can't question God, but instead it means that we know that we can ask questions. We can pour forth our anguish. We can expect that God will, in God's time, be present with us again, even if that presence is a presence in some way that we don't expect. And when that presence comes, as Teresa tells us, we can even respond back to God again with a questioning manner, or even with a little bit of bitterness or sharpness to our tone, and God will love us for it. We do those things whether we recognize it or not, whether we can experience it or not, because, of course, God is with us. Amen.